in this episode.
How decentralized that can be, it's another question. So I do believe that we can play by giving some type of diversity a role. So to give to experiment with different type of science funding and with different types of approach in science. And I think that can be very beneficial for technology, because in technology we do want the input from people, what they want and how they are experiencing something and so forth. So to start more from the customer or from the consumer and then construct a new technology and see what people are actually interested in having as a technology. For the more fundamental questions of science, I'm not sure that this is such a good idea, because precisely this epistemic authority. I mean, this idea of some epistemic democracy only works when you have some basic knowledge of the phenomenon. If you are asking me to estimate something where I have no understanding what people are talking about, then it's just simple guessing and it will just be random numbers. So we cannot pull any group knowledge from that. I would believe, again, optimization question, to which degree we should let something to be decided by the experts, and to which degree they let it be decided by some different type of a process.
Hey everyone, welcome to my conversation with philosopher of science, Dr. Vlasta Sikimić. It sure is good to be back. It's good to be back doing the podcast after a bit of a hiatus, as I did mention on my community post, but also in the previous episode. I did take about 6 weeks off because I moved to Sydney. I'm in a new city. I moved here to pursue a master's of research with, in fact, another guest that's been on the podcast who's going to be my supervisor, Professor Ines Hippolito. As I said, I did miss podcasting. I did miss preparing for these podcasts, doing all the study, and then, of course, having these great conversations that I've been privileged to have in the past year or so. On Vlasta, this, of course, is Vlasta's third appearance. I'm, needless to state, extremely grateful for her time. She's been very kind with being open to having these different conversations. We had the first podcast, or the first episode, that was dedicated to more of her work, and then afterwards we had an episode where we discussed some academic woes, let's say, by Sabine Hossenfelder. And in this one, we try to I wouldn't say answer, we try to discuss the question, does capitalism lead to scientific innovation? And we kind of look at this from different angles, from the angle of the private sector versus the public sector, how research and how academic funding takes place in these different sectors, the similarities and differences. We discussed a bit of how AI can be incorporated into academic research, and of course something Vlasta's researched on, grant reviewing and academic funding. And we kind of tried to approach this at a bit more philosophical level to this question of how best are resources allocated? Is it through some central authority, or as the Austrian school, people in the Austrian school like von Mises or Hayek say, through like a decentralized system, kind of like the free market. Regardless, I think we covered quite a lot of ground, and I hope you do find value in that. And certainly this episode was a lot more unstructured compared to more of a typical episode on this podcast, where I try and focus purely on the guest's work. But here we did discuss, there were many tangential points and tangential topics we touched on as we tried to kind of answer, though not really, this question, does capitalism lead to scientific innovation? I'd say one reason I wanted to talk to Vlasta was because this relationship between capitalism and innovation, or capitalism and science, I see it being discussed and explored a lot by people more in speculative philosophy, or even sociology, more from the continental philosophy side, or even Marxian theory and so on. However, Vlasta, she is doing research in Metascience, the Social Epistemology of Science, and as a philosopher, her work is very empirically driven, and I was more interested in getting her views on this matter. However, that being said, before we continue, a quick PSA. You may be aware that I've mentioned multiple times I'll never have advertisers or sponsors on this podcast. I simply don't have anything to sell you, and I deeply do believe that we live in a society of excess and overconsumption, and I don't want to contribute to that by selling you more things. That being said though, forgive the tautology, we ultimately live in the world we live in, and I can't continue this project and sustain it if I don't have any kind of financial support. So as uncomfortable as this makes me feel, I sincerely would like to ask you to consider supporting this podcast financially. Needless to state, your listenership and viewership is more than enough support. However, if you have the means, please do consider supporting me on Patreon, Substack, or even PayPal. And if you're wondering what are the perks, what are you gonna get? Nothing. Absolutely nothing, because I'm not selling you anything. You're not buying anything, but rather, if this podcast, if the work I've done has brought you any kind of value, if you've learned something new, do consider supporting me on these platforms, but to reiterate, only if you have the means. All right, back to the episode. As I was saying in that little PSA excerpt, I've tried to run this podcast for as long as I can without asking for any kind of audience support or funding. However, with how it's grown, with the guests I've got coming on, and all the extra work I've got to do, I think I've come to a point where I need to figure out how to make this a bit more monetarily sustainable. And that's why, even though I get really uncomfortable asking my listeners for financial support, I kind of have to. So yes, as I was saying, please do, if you have the means, certainly only if you have the means, please do consider supporting the podcast. In any case, be that as it may, back to the episode at hand. A quick formal introduction to Vlasta, as I tend to do. Also, as I did mention, we had 2 other episodes that I did with her. Please do go check them out too. I'll leave the links in the show notes. Dr. Vlasta Sikimić is an assistant professor of philosophy of science and a member of the philosophy and ethics group at Eindhoven University of Technology. Her research focus is on the social epistemology of science, metascience, philosophy of AI and ML in science, and philosophy of AI in education. With that being said, here's my conversation with Dr. Vlasta Sikimić, where we try to answer, or at least discuss the question, does capitalism lead to scientific innovation? One thing I want to say though is this, as before we started recording, as I kind of touched on, this topic, the relationship between scientific innovation and capitalism, at least the people I've been exposed to who discuss this topic, they generally come from, critical theory. It could be like Foucault, that kind of thing, or more like sociology, more like speculative philosophy. And one thing that interests me is to see the take or see the views of someone working more in empirical philosophy, kind of like what you do, and then more from the lens of metascience. And probably worth mentioning for the listeners. So put really simply, metascience is you take the scientific process, the methodology, and you apply it to science itself and see, like you study science through science, so to speak. Probably that's a very crude way of putting it, but that's my current understanding. So, and I wanted to kind of see, okay, how can we explore this topic? Does capitalism lead to scientific innovation? I feel, especially in our contemporary ideology, people just take it for granted that a lot of innovation takes place in the free market, in private industry. So maybe to set the pace, I think a good place to start from is scientific funding, as in research funding, a better way of putting it. And that's why I was glad when you shared that paper with me, which was, so obviously I'll leave a link to it in the description, in the show notes, how to improve research funding in academia, lessons from the COVID-19 crisis. So maybe at a high level, to set the pace, could you tell us what you were trying to explore in this paper? What questions were you asking? And then what some of the conclusions you came to pertaining to research funding in academia?
Thank you. In that paper, I was focusing on what was happening during the COVID-19 pandemic. And there I'm trying to criticize the elitist picture of Western science, that scientific breakthroughs happen all over the world. Plus, that in order to have the trustworthy science, we have to really accredit different places who did develop vaccines in a good way, and to communicate science accordingly. In addition to that, I discussed this relationship between industry and academia. First of all, what is important to note is that funding in industry can also be public funding. During COVID, these developments were publicly funded because it was a high priority that vaccines are developed. Second of all, we also know that there is quite some private capital or money in academic research. So there is no clear cut what people imagine that this should be publicly funded academia and privately funded industrial research. That's not the case. Actually, when something is considered of high value, even when industry produces it, it's publicly funded. Thus, the trustworthiness is not only about the source of where the money comes from. What I try to criticize there and to just hint at is this idea that in academia, we have certain system which is really, in my opinion, outdated and very elitist. And this system is not even mimicking the capitalist values necessarily. Of course, they enter from the pressure to be productive and from certain types of science evaluation. But in academia, there is this ideal of everybody wants, it's you are being told what you want. So you must want to be a full professor. You must want to get an individual grant. And that is like, you must want to be at an Ivy place. So this elitist paradigm, which is strange. You must want to publish in Nature Science Cell, which are the top journals. And in order to publish there, you must explore topics which are hot. Of course, these topics are also determined by the funding. And if there is more funding in a certain topic, that will be explored more. And that can really affect health of humans, because some diseases that are not necessarily affecting rich people will not be explored as much. At least that's I learned from my interviews with biologists, that they complain that if they would like to explore diseases that are important for the global south, with, of course, I mean, trying to be politically correct using this term, that they cannot publish it. First of all, it's hard to get funding. Second of all, they cannot publish it in such high journals. And that means that they are disincentivized to do it. Of course, they have some inherent motivation to do it. So in this paper, I'm trying to say, okay, the way how we are doing science now is not trustworthy in this sense. And another important topic that I think you would like to discuss and that you are touching upon is this quote, knowledge is power. And actually the relationship between power and knowledge, or the relationship between politics and science.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, that's for sure. Ultimately, I think that's the undergirding topic, or the undergirding theme for this whole conversation: the relationship between power, aka politics, and then science. Now, so first of all, I think I should probably mention this for the listeners. It's a complete misunderstanding that science is an objective enterprise the way we think. I mean, science, yes, the practice ideally can be objective, but if you look at the social epistemology of science, it certainly is an objective. And I would say, do listen to the episodes we did before. Your first episode, we discussed this. And then, of course, the one we did on Sabine Hossenfelder, the physicist, we discussed this as to the kind of the intricacies of the scientific process itself as it currently exists. But speaking of incentives, right? So one thing you mentioned is that, yes, we need to distinguish between research conducted in academia and research conducted in industry. So one criticism if I could take let's say a leftist, left-wing perspective of research done in industry, is that, I mean, gosh, this is not like some kind of abstruse topic. This is a huge topic nowadays with the whole AI revolution, as in it's a very important topic in the sense that, should AI research be left at the hands of private companies, or should it be something left to more the general public, regulations? It's an ongoing topic. As you know, this buzzword AI alignment, everyone's talking about it. So, but again, the kind of underlying philosophy there is it's because in industry, the fundamental driving force, the motivator is profit. And so some people, more like from the Austrian school, like Milton Friedman or Hayek, would say, "Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's exactly what drives innovation." But I think now the zeitgeist is changing a bit more, where they're like, that can't be the only incentive. That can't be the only incentive for, especially for scientific research. So my question, I'll ask it in a bipartite manner, Vlasta. First would be just in general, yeah, what are your views on that? Do you think that's accurate, that in industry it's always profits the number one motivator for research? And number two, can you speak to how it's like in more of a public institution? What are the incentives for like a researcher working at a place like a public university as opposed to like a big tech company, let's say?
I think you touched a lot of
Yeah,
topics
yeah,
in this.
yeah. I was just trying to bring it all into like one plane. I
Sure.
tend to always do this, but just to again to be succinct, I apologize. The first
No,
part is, what are your views on this kind of idea that, yeah, in private industry, profit's the only motivating force for research?
I understand. I understand the question. I just want to say, like, it deserves two answers. So the question
Oh
about
yeah, of
the
course, of course. Yeah, okay.
deserves a separate debate, and the question about funding is another one. Of course, well, let's start from science done in academic, conducted in an academic setting. We have first of all, we notice that when a lot of money is poured in science, there will be, usually we had in the past historically outcomes. So if we consider the Cold War, doesn't matter necessarily which political ideology was in place. When money was poured, stuff was happening.
Yeah,
And that is interesting by itself. And it is interesting also for the question of how much of that money was happening. So we have first like a one specific goal, develop something, like go to cosmos, right? Or we have like develop a vaccine. That is a very driven, like we know what we want as an outcome. But we can also have a more exploratory question, fundamental science. And it is also known that through that funding that went to physics mainly, a lot of math was also being developed on a more fundamental level. And when this is going to be applied, that remains to be seen. If we are thinking about social sciences, of course, ideology, the general ideology in the society will dictate which questions can be explored, how are they explored, how this is communicated. So the impact is strong. But I would like to just remind everyone that even in math, ideology can influence what's happening. And we use math as paradigmatic subject. If we think of this Pythagorean school, when they believe that everything can be expressed through a proportion and then discover that they are irrational numbers which cannot be expressed through a proportion, that was a huge problem. That's why they stopped exploring algebra in that way, but only focused on geometrical expressions of irrational numbers. But that was a huge problem because they had the philosophy behind it, so certain ideology behind it that didn't allow for irrational numbers. And those are certain, yeah. So science functions in a society and functions within certain paradigms and certain ideologies, or we can call them philosophies. And what happens is when we are funding it, we can have, and that's why it's really context dependent. I think of the question of how to fund science as an optimization question, how to fund it for a specific purpose, in a specific context. So I don't think we can give one global answer. It's more local answers. And we can more kind of reflect on the system. But what is happening within academia, we can have the influence of the public, and the public can say and often says, look, what you are doing there is not really bringing too much profit, it's too foundational. Why would we finance foundational research? Why would we finance so much social sciences when natural sciences are bringing, I don't know, more profit? So all sorts of arguments one can hear, and it really depends on a society where one is. In addition to that, we have the funding agencies, which are some type of political organizations that are deciding what to fund and what is the priority, not only based on the votes, but also based on certain ideology. Then we have the individual scientists, which have their own interests, and they can also influence all these other opinions because they're communicating which type of research is good, which type of research is cited, and are evaluating each other through this peer review process. So there is, in my opinion, this complex picture. And then we add this additional layer, how to fund it using AI, or how the AI plays into this picture, we have a big problem. And from my perspective, no, we cannot just let it freely float. There has to be some normative recommendation how to fund it from, for instance, Social Epistemology of Science or Metascience. Metascience, I would more understand like observing science from a meta perspective, not necessarily only through scientific methods. I mean, arguably, because philosophy is not necessarily a science, and there is this fuzzy line between them. And giving these normative recommendations, what should be funded and how science should be structured, with the goal of obtaining most knowledge. And that's where I do believe we need certain expertise, because if we are just running in this loop of the public opinion, I think we are in a great danger that there won't be epistemic progress.
Yes.
And yeah, now you can ask a lot of questions about that.
I have a lot. I mean, in fact, I have a whole section here in my notes regarding democracy and science, and then even this growing anti-intellectualism, which I see pervasive, especially in the past like 15 years. But to follow on from that, Vlasta, I mean, there were a lot of stuff to touch on there, so I took some notes down. I don't think we'll lose track here. But regarding this private industry, and you've touched on this. In fact, you make an interesting point in this paper. You say that one thing, which is a good point. Like one thing I think, me being a leftist, I'm very critical of private industry. But for instance, one thing, a lot of these big private corporations, because not for any virtuous reason, but simply because they want to protect their PR, their public brand identity, whatnot, is they try to maintain some level of decency within these organizations. So there are like HR departments that are overlooking the existing kind of cultures and the systems. So with things like harassment, especially like what women face, or historically and even now face, any kind of harassment, there are HR departments overlooking and ensuring this doesn't happen in a workplace. And then you point out, correct me if I'm wrong here, that might not always, they won't have such robust, effective mechanisms in universities or public institutions, to protect against things like harassment. But whereas in private industry, you do see that quite a lot. And also because it's kind of like driven by the market, if the word gets out, as we've seen, companies are boycotted. And now I don't know how effective those boycotts are, to be honest, but at least there's this semblance of they need to protect their reputation amongst general public. Now, I don't know if the same mindset applies or the perspective applies to public institutions. But anyway, this is a long-winded way of me saying or asking that the first part of my previous question, which is like, yes, so what are your views on research and innovation in private industry? And do you think fundamentally the sole motivator, the ultimate incentive structure that undergirds it all is purely just profit? Or do you think there's something more in private industry than just profit?
And that's a loaded question. Let's say first, in private sector, we can have, as I said again, also public money coming from what public perceives as of high interest. The second thing there, which I think is interesting, is of course that private companies, some can be really nice and can fund fundamental research from some profit that they're making, or fund drug development on rare diseases or something that's not overly profitable. So they can be altruistic. It's just the question is, do they have some inherent motive to do it? Or it's always like through this public pressure. I mean, just having having too much unregulated power that one can just decide, okay, we have all this data, we have all these methods, we are holding so much in our hands, and then we're gonna blackmail everyone with that. That can be very dangerous. So even if so we don't want someone to have such a power, even if we believe that these are nice people, because power can always be abused unless there is type of control on it. That is one answer to one question of kind of what can go wrong. But to answer the culture in a company, the culture in a company has something to do with the fact that these people who go for companies usually think, okay, I'm an employee and I can go to another company and I have some expectations from the company, and these companies are competing and so on, and I go home. Of course, there is also this punishment from the public, but it's also kind of from the employees themselves and certain expectations. Plus, in order to be productive, so for instance, if we want to people report to us that some mistake was made, we have to have a good error culture in a company. Somebody did a mistake, goes in a pharma company, goes and tells, look, I did this mistake. We will not overreact, not overly punished, because we want that mistakes are reported so that nothing is produced that has a problem. And in academia, because of this, what I was mentioning before, where people are being sold that this is their vocation, that they have to want this, that this measures their own intelligence, success, and I don't know what. So this whole strange society that has these implicit rules, which are not right. So they're not always explicit, they're implicit rules and pressures that can then these type of things can happen. So that people don't report mistakes to their principal investigators, because the principal investigator will be very upset, because principal investigator is not trained how to react properly, or they don't know what to do, or what one person whom I interviewed said, like she had a really nice PI, but and you could do everything, just not stay pregnant, because if you're pregnant, then you cannot. Then that costs the money of the project, and 1 year a person is gone, and that's a huge problem for the whole project. So such things can happen in academia. On the other hand, it's also important to notice that in academia, not everything is so professionalized. And there are a lot of people on some type of manager positions, which are maybe not necessarily, of course, some are trained, but not everyone is trained. And maybe not everyone is even motivated to do that. That's more like expected. So some people would just like to do research and not necessarily these administrative tasks, but they still have to. And that is draining. So there can also be issues in this respect. And something that I'm recently noticing, which was not mentioned in this paper, is that it can also go in different ways. So that, a proper balance has to be established between different type of power. So usually what I had initially always as a worry was, okay, someone who is, I don't know, a PhD student will suffer from this oppressive system. But then the higher you go in the hierarchy, you understand that also people in higher positions really suffer from the system. And if this is not being carefully conducted, you do notice that, also principal investigators can really have severe damage if the people that they hired are not working properly. And the whole project can have damage, even if, for instance, this principal investigator is great. And I think just it requires quite some, first of all, changes of these explicit rules, which can work or not, but it requires a lot of changes in these implicit rules. And that's not so easy. And there we notice the problem and dissatisfaction with the work conditions that scientists actually have.
Yeah, and the implicit rules are generally the ones you can't formalize. It's the hardest part, right? Because it's culture. It's not written anywhere. It's something more implicit in our day-to-day practices. So, all right, before we get to more of the topic at hand regarding capitalism, Vlasta, I'm more curious. So, all of these criticisms you made, completely, that they make total sense to me. However, why can't one make the same arguments about private industry too? Or why can't one make the same criticisms about private industry too? So my question put simply is, at a fundamental level, what's the difference between public and private sectors? As in the same criticisms you made about how in the hierarchy people at the top could be affected too. Can't that argument be made even for the private sector? Or is there something in the incentive structure such that those arguments don't apply for the private sector?
I could imagine that they can apply. And that's why I said it's really context dependent. So if we are having the companies that have a good culture, where someone was really thinking about how to professionalize the workflow, how to work professionally on the communication, then of course they will be better off. But for sure that we have companies in the world that are not following such standards, and there the issues would happen again. I do believe that one difference is this perception of that we are in academia really being sold, this is what we have to want.
Yeah, in fact, sorry, you made this point like even before. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that? I think I know sort of like in my gut viscerally what you mean, but I can't put words to it. So yeah, that idea of we being told what to want. What do you mean by that?
That and that can happen. I mean, that capitalism in general often has this component itself that tells us, oh, you have to want to accumulate.
Which desires, yeah.
Exactly. And then we have this authority, which is not only telling us this is allowed, this is not allowed, but it's telling us what we should want. Like we should want more money, we should want more assets, we should want to have, I don't know, holidays on a fancy destination and drive expensive cars or whatever. Then we lose our authentic self. And that's not good. But in academia, this elitist picture is shifted. And it's not necessarily so much about money, even though money does play some role, but it's about the prestige.
Yeah.
And what is their prestigious and who is then the smartest, whatever that means, because we do know that from psychology, this is not the way how one should think about it. And that's why people then would be able to spend so many hours and compete with each other so much. But it also, of course, I don't want to generalize too much. It does depend on a microclimate in which one is working, because as we mentioned, we can, in some of our previous interviews, we can also have the opposite, where people are really demotivated to do anything and are just getting funding and are not doing much with it. So we can also we have both of these two dangerous forces, and that's why I say it's an optimization problem to find the middle between these two grounds. So people that are not overpressed to this level that they are even ready to cheat, and that they are not completely like just saying, oh, we are getting money irrespectively of how much work we are putting into, so let's put minimal work and just enjoy in our titles and the privileges that we are getting, and let's not select anyone who can endanger us on any position. I mean, by endangering, I mean anyone who can challenge the system by working hard. So, and I noticed both. I mean, I experienced it. I experienced both systems, and there I think it's a challenge to find some middle ground in between. So to motivate people enough, but also to give them enough space that they are what they want to be, and that they are doing how much they want to do, and that they have some more autonomy in their work. But that autonomy is in the end limited because everybody there has a job which has a certain job description and certain expectations that have to be met.
Yes, I mean
that's why I'm saying it's an optimization problem among many different factors.
Yeah, but also, Vlasta, this is an important point you touched on. So previously you mentioned something. You said this idea that, okay, if you take something like when Americans wanted to go to the moon, a defined goal. It's a predefined goal. We know exactly what you want to get at. COVID, certainly. Vaccine creation, expediting the vaccine creation process. It's a defined goal. But isn't the fundamental challenge, and here's where I'd say I'm very much a leftist defending public institutions here, isn't the fundamental challenge with science, or really any kind of research at the more foundational levels, is that the outcome is never defined. Like we don't know what the outcome of any kind of research will be. And I mean, we discussed this with Professor Daniel Larkins in our podcast too, where in fact a lot of science is built on failure, as in what we expect doesn't happen, and isn't so. I guess my question to you would be what structures do you think should be set up? This is a huge, big ask. I know we can't get into this in one discussion, but what structures should be set in, or that are already have been put in, where this fundamental challenge in science, where the outcome isn't defined, there aren't any predefined metrics that tell us, like in industry, okay, you tick these boxes, then we know that it's the problem solved. Kind of this uncertainty, the fact that it's not deterministic, how can to address that for researchers, in your view, what do you think should be put in the social epistemology of science, both in private and public sector, but perhaps more importantly in public sector?
In the social epistemology tells us, let's try to do some structural changes on the group level, not necessarily on the individual level, in order to maximize the knowledge. And there we talk a lot about diversity, but a diversity with a certain limit, because too much diversity will also not lead to any convergence towards results. But for instance, one measure is, let's fund diverse ideas to a certain degree, and then these diverse ideas A lot of them will fail, but some will be successful. But it's not only about, in my opinion, about the failure, it's also about a lot of research that we are having is not being applied, and maybe will be applied one day. Maybe it will never be applied. Maybe it just helps us to create a coherent picture of the world. And that's all fine, in my opinion. And it still needs to be there. What I think the AI challenge is bringing to us is something new, which we didn't have to face yet. This is enormous proliferation of all type of information and all type of potential knowledge that someone will have to assess and utilize in a certain way. And we are noticing this more and more with this like very result-driven and science that is just being published, right? So what for instance, Daniel would say is for sure, okay, let's maybe slow down the process. Let's give more credit to the research on the replication studies. Let's give more credit to research that fails but has a good idea. So to the registered reports, let's check for methodology more carefully. And that is all helpful. However, with AI, we have like, sure, AI can help us check some of these things, but can also at the exponential pace just generate more knowledge, papers, things that are happening around us. And then the main task will be for us as humans to see what has epistemic value. This epistemic value doesn't necessarily have to be some applied value, but what is bringing the knowledge further. And that is a challenge that we currently already have to kind of recognize in different science what is a fruitful question, what is an important topic, and what is not. But with this huge proliferation, that will be an even bigger challenge. And there I would like to just reflect about some other very interesting idea. I mean, notion is there are certain topics like slowing down aging or reversing aging if possible, and doing regenerative medicine and so on. And there, for instance, there is funding for it, also private funding for it. But the publications there's so many publications precisely because of that, and the replicability is not very high. And I'm sure there will be even more funding in the future, and this will be an even bigger topic in the future. But then we are noticing that can also have a negative trend, in the sense that when there is so much stuff which we cannot see what has a valuable information and what is junk, that will slow down the progress. And there, of course, some control measures are important. And there, again, that's something that Daniel would say, okay, we want to really now penalize researchers also in academia, then they publish something which is not methodologically sound. And yeah, some type of control mechanisms also need to exist there. And yeah, some real responsibility needs to be taken.
Yeah. And okay, I think this is a perfect segue to kind of more of the theoretical side of this conversation, which is this ultimately it boils down to between authority versus decentralized knowledge, right? So, which is why when I emailed you before, Vlasta, I mentioned the Austrian school and Ludwig von Mises. So this example you use is good example, because it's like, yes, at one point you need some kind of authority, some kind of almost like a meta-analysis to discern between what's good science and junk science, or good research and junk research. And I don't know, again, I don't know in theory if such a thing can be done in any decentralized manner where it's left to the so-called market mechanisms or democracy or whatnot. Or if we need something a bit more, in fact, yeah, something a bit more traditional where it's just an authority, be it peer reviews, or I don't know. I don't know practically how it looks like. But in theory, what I'm trying to say is like we need some kind of centralized body that does discern between good research versus junk research as it pertains to scientific innovation. So yeah, a lot of thoughts there, but just curious to hear what, at like a very theoretical level, what your views on that are.
Mhm. My views on that are, first of all, that we have to differentiate between epistemic authority and general authority.
Okay.
And epistemic authority is the authority of knowledge. So we do trust the textbooks, even if we question some other type of authority. And in order that we progress in learning, we are learning by trusting epistemic authority. That's how we reach a certain level. Of course, that science should be questioned, and of course, that when we are aware how science functions, we will not trust science blindly. That's completely fine. However, there is something in the epistemic authority and in the epistemic expertise which do take time to acquire. And we do rely on, I don't know, medical experts when we go to a hospital because we cannot
Yeah.
do everything. And we are somehow, relying on the epistemic competencies and epistemic authority of people around us. And that's rational to do. In this sense, of course, epistemic authority plays a role and should be listened to. And actually, science nowadays is indeed also funded by listening to all these factors, right? By listening to the general public, by listening to epistemic authority, and by listening to some political authority. And all these three types of decision make all these three types of decision making power interact with each other, because the politics is influenced by the general public and by scientists, and scientists are also influencing both the politics and general public indirectly, and so on. So there is this interaction, and that's how we are going further with some type of epistemic progress. So I think that's for me important. And how decentralized that can be, it's another question. So I do believe that we can play by giving some type of diversity our role. So to give to experiment with different type of science funding and with different types of approach in science. And I think that can be very beneficial for technology, because in technology we do want the input from people, what they want and how they are experiencing something, and so forth. So to start more from the customer or from the consumer, and then construct a new technology and see what people are actually interested in having as a technology. For the more fundamental questions of science, I'm not sure that this is such a good idea, because precisely this epistemic authority. I mean, this idea of some epistemic democracy only works when you have some basic knowledge of the phenomenon. If you are asking me to estimate something where I have no understanding what people are talking about, then it's just simple guessing, and it will just be random numbers. So we cannot pull any group knowledge from that. I would believe, again, optimization question, to which degree we should let something to be decided by the experts, and to which degree we let it be decided by some different type of a process.
Yeah, I mean, also just to clarify, I'm not talking about the kind of the open science movement here, which I'm totally for. I mean,
Okay.
the idea of making science transparent. I guess, in fact, you put it properly. It's like the authority, should it come from the people, so to speak, the general public, or should it come from more of the established institutions? So you're saying that it's, well, firstly, context dependent, depends on the kind of science, but also it's an optimization problem. So actually, when you mean an optimization problem, can you kind of elaborate on what exactly that looks like in a practical basis? Like, how do we optimize for this question? Like that even sounds like a machine learning question. Like, we have an optimization function in machine learning. So, like, as in, what do you mean by optimization in this regard?
Yeah, we can say, okay, I mean, it does. It can be done even with machine learning. So we can, sorry?
No, I mean, sorry, go ahead. That's my point. Like, you can even have like a function that optimizes for a certain attribute. So,
Yes. So we can ask ourselves, how long should the project be funded, how to structure a research group, and really find an optimum between these things for instance, yeah, using machine learning. That's in one of my papers, I think you read it,
yes.
being discussed and being used as a method. But we can also think of it from this bigger perspective. So how much we want to give for fundamental research, how much we want to give for applied research, how much we give to humanities, how much we give to social sciences, natural sciences, how are we classifying these sciences? That's also a question. And then we are trying to find, based on the funding that we have, what could be the optimum, and based on the goals that we have, how to split the cake. And we can also experiment by changing, right? And see whether certain changes will bring something good later on. The other optimization problem that I talked about is the way how we are motivating people in an academic institution. So how much pressure are we putting on them and how much freedom we're giving to them? But I don't only mean academic freedom, but I mean also general, like, work decisions, how much autonomy they have in their everyday life to decide on different questions regarding their work. Plus, how are we, like, yeah, having these, who is going to be promoted, how much this person has to work, and we don't want that people are being burned out, but we also don't want them to be completely demotivated. And that depends also on the cultural context in which people are working, and the general values, attitudes that are happening in that society. And you can notice, for instance, I don't know, let's use my home country. There much more was invested in, well, maybe not invested, but the culture differs between natural sciences and social sciences. And in social sciences, one would like to improve it. And the incentives and the values, the objective measures that are used in natural ones, of course, it can also be better there. In social ones, people are defending and saying, no, we don't want that. We don't want that. We want to publish in our own language. We don't want foreigners. We have to preserve our language. We have to preserve even the Cyrillic script, even though we can also use Latin. Yeah, that is really important. If anybody tries to attack us, we have the academic freedom to, yeah, do what we did in the previous 80 years ago. We don't want much change, and that is not helpful.
So more conservative approach, more of
Very,
conservative. Yeah.
yes, a very conservative approach that did come from a socialist perspective.
That's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, at least for us, meaning in Australia, the conservative approach just it always comes more from. In fact, I'd even say it comes from the hard sciences, whereas it's the social sciences and more of the humanities that are pushing towards different kinds of viewing epistemology. So I find it interesting that in Serbia, in your case, it comes more from the other side.
Yes, and again, there is probably some historic explanation, because back in the days, they were really important and they were studying Marxism and they had quite some funding and quite some money, and no one was really challenging or questioning them, and they like to keep their status.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, I
And
mean, yeah.
but I just want to say that's why I said that it's really context dependent. So we cannot really generalize it. So it really depends on a specific culture and what happened there, and these reasons why this happened can be very contingent, right? Due to some historic development that was happening in a specific country and in a specific culture. So it's not universal. That's why it's an optimization question in a given context.
Yeah, and over here, I think it's worth mentioning for the listeners, please do go read Mel Andrews wrote a paper called Machine Learning's Set Theory-Free Ideal. It's one of the best papers I read on the philosophy of AI, because their whole point is that because of this idea of things are context dependent, and we can't have one single objective metric to measure all of science, all of epistemology through, that a lot of it is dependent on culture, context, time, historical circumstances, that there's always there's, we can't have like a system that kind of just goes on forever without intervention from some kind of human authority. And there's this notion, which I think it's a lot more prevalent than we think in the AI ML world, that we can have a sort of objective science without any kind of intervention or human bias. And the point Mel makes in that paper is that that's only an ideal, but in reality, it's impossible to have any kind of thinking without some kind of human bias, some kind of context of a certain culture. So yeah, I'd probably mention that paper because it's an excellent paper, and I'm a big fan of Mel's work. Uh, cool. All right.
Yes, I'm also a fan of Mel's work and yeah,
Yeah,
her as a person.
yeah, you said that you both met at some conference, right?
Yes,
That's great.
yes.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear. Whenever I like the guests I've had on, when they already know each other's work, I feel like I'm building a small network of thinkers on my podcast. So it's very it's a good feeling. I'll put it that
But
way.
if I can give some note to that, I completely agree that it is very context dependent and that machine learning brings us to all these questions. What I'm noticing and what is my point is if we are using machine learning to decide which type of science to fund or to decide to whom to give a grant, and that can be a helpful tool in a sense that it can be efficient. And we might think that it's less biased, but of course it will replicate human biases. But what I think is even more dangerous is that it will only tell us what the data on which it's trained has inside. So it will just perpetuate the beliefs from the past, and we do update our beliefs. And we do update our epistemic norms. And I think our epistemic norms nowadays are higher than the ones in the past, and that's what I call this epistemic progress. So my worry there would be that it could hinder the epistemic progress.
Yes, and now another paper I should mention here. I don't know if you've written more because this was published in 2022. Is you wrote a paper, Machine Learning in Scientific Grant Review. And I believe you do touch on some of these topics in that paper regarding kind of applying ML to scientific funding and grant review. So I'll leave a link to that also in the description down below. Or are there any more recent work you've done on the matter, Vlasta? Because this is from a while.
Well, it's currently under review.
Oh, okay, yeah. Because in fact, I remember in one of our conversations you said that you're going more into the philosophy of education as it pertains to machine learning. And
That is actually published,
okay,
and that is on the global justice and use of AI in education.
gotcha. Yeah, I'll email you and I'll leave a link to those in the description down below too for those interested. Because one thing I noticed is I get emails from people after the podcast asking for the paper, And then even I forget which paper we discussed in the middle of the conversation. So now I try to open the tabs as we go so that it's easier for me when I do, edit the podcast. Anyway, that's a bit of a side point there. I apologize. So, now one thing I realized was that people are going to be in the comment section, we're going to get bombasted because of this. Is that the topic of the video or the topic of the podcast was, well, yeah, can capitalism lead to scientific innovation? Now, we've had all these tangential conversations regarding funding. So let me just ask you plainly, yeah, in your views, how would you, if respond to such a question if someone just asks downright, does capitalism lead to scientific innovation? Or would you beg to differ?
I would say science leads to scientific innovation, and the type of in different systems we had scientific innovations, that is a fact. But whether a system itself, I think I think the discussion is a simplification, right? So I would return to this big question of the knowledge and power.
Yeah.
And how power uses knowledge, and so from the perspective of the power, the knowledge is needed also to solve some everyday problems, but also to remain on power. And we can, have this type of ideology that is framing us and limit our way of thinking and our way of researching. And again, that can come from many different type of ideologies, not only from capitalism. I do find it, so the question of the how if science is just used to justify a certain system, well, not only used for that, but when science is used to justify a certain system, that of course is not good social science, or not good humanities, or not a good philosophy, because in my opinion, philosophy should open our borders and the limits of our thinking. But when it comes to science, I think it's really tricky. For instance, 1 year ago, Slavoj Žižek gave some interview or spoke on a Slovenian network, and he was saying, okay, capitalism is in crisis, and people will start looking at former Yugoslavia and search for some solutions there. However, if you look at science in former Yugoslavia, it's not that it was so amazing, admittedly, because there was not so much money. And money does help that science develops. And maybe we should not expect from science too much, but just to keep in mind, right? So when we had, even before this Cold War, we had this other big race, which was about the atomic bomb.
Oh, for sure.
And Heisenberg and his team, what would have, how the planet would look if they were slightly more successful in their attempts. And so I think that science can, natural science can more or less be neutral or not neutral to the politics. Social science is very, very influenced by the ideology. But all in all, of course, with money, science can do different things, and these things can be destructive or can be constructive. And now with this AI idea, we can also have some scientific solutions that can invade privacy enormously. And then it's a question to us, or of course, always science developed for the military purpose, which is highly disturbing. But then, countries, they want to race with each other, and that's how they generate their power. And that's what generates also the economic power, which, again, so science by itself is not answering that. Maybe it should, maybe it could, maybe that's the role of philosophy. maybe the border between philosophy and other sciences is fuzzy. So we all together have to say, okay, well, this is a responsible research. This should have an ethical permit. This shouldn't have an ethical permit. But that science, yeah, that some knowledge, when we have some knowledge, when we have a way to cure a disease, when we have a way to harm other people using science and technology, that gives power. And that can, I mean, then we go back to these questions. Okay, but what is our ideology? Do we want to harm people? Do we want to be ethical? What do we want? How are we going to collaborate with each other? How are we going to build trust with each other? How are we going to have trustworthy science? And yeah, science by itself is not so colored. It
Yeah.
can go in different ways. And there, of course, and with AI and expansion of AI, a lot of these questions will resurface. Also with the political scenarios currently in the world, they are resurfacing. And I do believe that philosophy has a lot to say and is needed for that. And then philosophy has to try to go above the boundaries of certain ideologies, if
Yeah.
possible, because it's not easy.
Certainly. In fact, Floss, I have 2 points to make on this. I think there was a lot that you made there, which was really, really interesting. Because firstly, you said something about these problems, should they be addressed by science? A person that I'm reminded here is I've had Professor Streamers on the podcast. He's from the University of New York. He wrote a book called The Knowledge Machine. Excellent book. It's kind of on, it's really on the history of science. But as he is exploring the history of science, it becomes like a book on the philosophy of science. And Professor Streamers, his whole point is that no, science should not be addressing these problems. Like science is it should stick to a very limited, narrow scope of epistemology, and it does it well. It does it better than any other epistemic tools we have that humanity collectively has. But that these questions should be addressed more by sociologists, and by perhaps even social scientists, but that's from a different perspective, but certainly by philosophers. So his whole point is that science shouldn't, even though, and he too accepts the fact that there's no objective science in that kind of like naive sense, but he does say that science shouldn't get too involved in sort of trying to self-correct itself or like trying to see which kind of science makes sense, but rather it should just stick to rigorous empiricism, research, and let more philosophers step in. And this is where I connect you to my second point, which is the point Zizek makes. I don't know if you recall, but Stephen Hawking wrote that famous book called The Brief History of Time. And in that book, he ends the book by saying that we don't need philosophy anymore. Philosophy it's a thing of the past. Now science will give us all the answers. We can find all necessary truths through science, just this physics in this case. Oh, but then the point Zizek makes is he writes on this. He says that what really Professor Hawkins was writing there, it was a reflection of a zeitgeist, of an ethos in our culture, where we thought it was a real optimism we had, especially with like the Vienna Circle, the logical positivists. They were like, wow, we don't need any of these metaphysics and boring ethics, all these questions. All these questions, we will have answers through the scientific process. Now I contend, and I think Zizek, he kind of identified this in the early 2000s, but also post Cold War, that philosophy is coming back. Like there are some questions that there's no way you can answer them without having a philosophical lens, which is why every single podcast you see, there's some philosopher on it. Because all these questions are at a certain level, they become philosophical questions, which involve the difficult, annoying work of ethics or metaphysics or asking foundational questions that you can't simply follow the data or follow the evidence. That doesn't really work. So I don't know. I don't know whether you want to comment on that, but when you were discussing those are two things that came to my mind. The idea that philosophy is coming back. It's coming back in some sense not because we wanted to come back, because whenever philosophy does come back, it comes at a time of crisis. Uh, but it's coming back because we sort of are at a time of crisis in terms of our epistemology globally.
Yeah, the question is, has science killed philosophy? And we even had a conference dedicated to that. I mean,
Interesting.
this,
And
yeah.
what were the insights
I mean, I can tell you my
yeah,
opinion.
please do. Yeah.
And one is, first of all, uh, science does function within some philosophical background. This is what we try to, so within some framework. That's what we try to talk about here. That it's really hard to exit your own positionality and do your science so rigorously that there is no philosophical or ideological assumptions behind it. And that's why I was mentioning the Pythagorean school, but let's also mention contemporary math, right? So whether someone is operating according to Platonistic principles or constructivistic principles, that is a certain belief set behind it and certain assumptions that are leading us to different type of results. So it's hard to exit our framework even in these paradigmatic cases and that are considered to be exceptionally objective. And the second question is like, okay, so okay, science does come with some philosophical assumptions behind it, but okay, but what is happening um, with philosophy and this empirical turn in philosophy, which I like? Well, we are saying, okay, now the line between philosophy and other sciences is becoming fuzzy, but that is completely fine. Why do we need rigid distinctions?
I agree. I completely agree.
We just, yeah. So why do we have to think in these rigid terms? And we need some normative perspective, of course. And this normative perspective is not only so it's telling us instead of what is the case and what will be the case, it tells us what should be the case for a certain purpose. And that's not only ethical framework. That's what I try always to teach my students. So normative doesn't only mean ethical. We can have the normative suggestions in epistemology. So normative suggestions telling us how we should learn, how we should structure the learning process, how we should manage information. Whether that's going to happen or not, it's another question, but we are giving the normative recommendation how something should be done. And that's definitely this critical thinking, critical reflections, and normative recommendations are definitely what we need. And it's definitely coming back with AI, but it was also, I believe, there all the time. And when people question me and tell me like, oh, why do you do philosophy, that's a thing of the past and so on, and then I we just start discussing their core beliefs and expectations about life or their core political beliefs and so on, and then they realize, okay, yeah, our religion, our our political system, our values, how we are living our life, that has so many philosophical components, and philosophy was always there. And then just how, and even I tell them, even this anti-philosophy or this like seriously empirical
That's
turn
philosophy.
is the type of philosophy.
Philosophy, yeah, 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 yeah. In fact, I'm reading this book on the Vienna Circle, and the whole point is it's so funny the way the author writes because it's a beautifully written book, and the point he tried Carl Sigmund, Austrian mathematician, he says that the all of them tried to be so the Vienna Circle they tried to be anti-metaphysics and anti-philosophical, and it ended up becoming a complete philosophy circle by trying to negate philosophy. So it's funny how these paradoxes creep in. And another thing here is just on the history of philosophy, and this is why again I'm really interested in this philosophy coming back. It's rearing its ugly head, so to speak. Is that the but in the time of Socrates, I was reading this in that there was great turmoil and uncertainty in ancient Greece at the time, when all these Socratic thinkers came into being and they started asking these questions: what is virtue? What is good? What is this? What? And it seems to me that we are going through one of those our epoch with AI, but not only AI, but even with this the accelerationism of capitalism and technology. We're going through a similar thing where these our foundations are being are being shattered, and we're trying to find trying to ask these foundational questions. So in some sense, I would say this, like, you can't help but be philosophical in our times. Like you can't even live, even if you're not interested in these questions, just day to day, there's some kind of framework we work through. So I found that quite interesting. And Vlasta, I want to touch on something that you just mentioned. As you were, uh, you know, highlighting your points, you did say whether that's going to happen or not is a different question. So what I believe what you were saying is we can make these normative prescriptions, we can talk about how should science be done, but the question is whether that's going to happen or not. That whether is what I want to discuss now. And here's what I mean by that. So um, we've got about 20 minutes. So I don't know if we can cover all of this within the given time. I want to put on a complete Marxist lens here and discuss material conditions or material circumstances. And I really want to touch on this because at the end of the day, we can do all this research. You as others, the publishing you've been doing, you've published all this work, but there's this fundamental deadlock almost in our society that so much of our existence, our social lives, be it academia or outside of academia, is conditioned. It's structured by material conditions, right? So I mean, if someone hasn't got food to eat, if someone hasn't got a roof over their head, if they've got job anxiety or they haven't got job security, forget about thinking about science. You just want to make your basic necessities met. So I'm going to try and introduce a thinker here, which I don't know where we're going to go with this, but there's this person called David McKerricker. He runs this platform called Theory Underground. And he has this concept called time energy. And I'm reading his book right now. He'll be on the podcast soon. So I've just got it here. He defines time energy. So this is a very speculative philosophy as large energy infused, repeatable blocks of time to be used reliably between us and us as in social agents. And his whole point is for us to do anything that requires creative work, any kind of thinking. So be it intellectual work, scientific work, philosophy, or the arts, you're an artist, a musician, you need time energy. And what he posits through more like a Heideggerian Marxist lens is that in contemporary society, we don't have time energy except a tiny elite of people who have an enormous amount of power, as you said, knowledge is power, and money, and this concept of time energy. So I don't even know how to like ask this question from you, but what I'm trying to say is that, like, yes, we can have these discussions about, kind of like normative claims, like how should science be done. But at the end of the day, I don't know, maybe I'm being a bit too cynical here, but given our material conditions of the fact that, yeah, people don't have time, people don't have energy, and precarious job conditions in academia, so on and so forth, are these changes really gonna take place? Like, are you optimistic about science, or do you think that in some sense people are gonna be overtaken by this constant capitalist machine and it's just gonna be work, work, work and make more money as you mentioned? So there was a lot there, but I don't know, just a few thoughts for you to reflect on there.
Yeah, so there is definitely already, as you point out, already from the ancient Greece, this idea that philosophy is only done when we have enough free time to do it.
Exactly.
But one should also keep in mind, like, all other stigmas and who was actually free in ancient Greece and who wasn't
The
and who had all
aristocrat, the
this
privileged class. Yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of these great philosophers, they come from the aristocracy. You know, Leibniz to Descartes, they're very privileged.
men.
And they're men, and they're men. Yeah.
I mean, many
Yeah.
different things to be discussed there. But yeah, so we I think everyone has some philosophical view on the world, like literally almost every human being.
Yeah, it's
Right? So
impossible.
it's hard for me to imagine a human being that doesn't really have it. So we do ask ourselves certain type of questions inherently and are trying to answer to them. And I think we constantly have, so we have with science, we are trying to explain the nature and something unpredictable. And with philosophy, we are trying to answer this basic question of the meaning of life. Why are we here? What are we doing? How are we interacting with others? And those are very, I think, even, in
Ex-
children, these questions arise. Uh,
Existentially.
Yes, so I do believe that, and we all, maybe we don't have a critical reflection on them, but we definitely have some stances. And developing our critical reflection on them is demanding and challenging. And you can see that people sometimes consider this not important, but actually for the work that we are having, it's really important the way how we are communicating with other people, how we are communicating with ourselves. It's important for our society. It's something that is transmitted through education and it's connected with education. That's why I think education plays a super important role, connects with science, but connects also with philosophy
Sure.
and how that whole system is functioning. Of course, when someone is in a survival mode, that person is first focused on satisfying the basic needs. And there we have this trick of like, are we really in a survival mode? Or we are just tricked to think that we are in a survival mode. Again, it really depends on where we live and how much resources we have. So do we live in a country in a rich country with social security, or we really live somewhere where life is very difficult? If we live in a war zone, we might actually have a lot of philosophical thoughts because we are facing death all the time, and loss and so on. But of course, then we are also fighting for our own lives, and it's not. But I mean, a lot of people also in the wars, they keep diaries
Yeah,
and
like
and
Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Viktor Frankl. There's some great books that have come from the Holocaust or the Gulag. So that's a good point.
it is, it's a multi-layered question. But I think it's what I think is really important is this other thing is to say, okay, maybe we don't. So for us who are relatively privileged, maybe we can say to ourselves, okay, maybe we don't have to, play in the game of chasing something, but actually ask ourselves, okay, is this what we are chasing? Something that we authentically want? Is this really going to bring us happiness or fulfillment? It doesn't even have to be framed as happiness, but it's actually some self-actualization, fulfillment. Will this really give the meaning of our life? Or one day on the deathbed, we will say, okay, great, we had all this money, but for what? Or aggregated all this wealth, but for what? Or maybe it's nicer actually we save someone and help nature than aggregating so much. Or what is making us happy? Is it making us happy to go to an animal shelter and help there? Is it I mean, those are very important questions that one has to ask and try to ask. So yeah, let's stop running after something. Let's take a break and then really see what is meaningful for us, because just this constant chase and this implicit authority telling us, but the implicit authority does come, of course, from the financial interest of consumerism, telling us you just want to accumulate more and more and more. And that's the priority. And if you don't accumulate enough, you will not survive. Yeah, that is of course a problem. And there I would say, yes, let's stop there and then maybe reflect more philosophically and see what fulfills us, whether that's art, whether that's philosophy, whether that's science, or maybe something completely different, like meditation or going to the nature and so on.
I mean, also, absolutely, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I take that advice to heart, as someone who looks up to you. But here's where, again, I'm getting a bit critical or even cynical. It's like the reason I brought up the concept of time energy is that fundamentally, when I was reading David's book, he makes all the points that you made. He's like, yes, we have to make this individual decision. But don't you think there are in some sense, there's only so much we can individually decide that our social structures, in some sense, dictate how we live our lives individually. And so I don't know, again, I really don't know what the answer is, but it, we need both individual action and collective action. Like it
Yes.
can't, because what I find is sometimes, and I see this happen a lot, especially in like the business or like circles where they make everything an individual problem. So they make social problems an individual problem. And there's even a strain of misogyny and sexism too in the past. Like I've read this book by this French philosopher. Like this is a terrible term, but in the past, like they used to call women hysterical. That's how women went into like psychoanalysis. And her whole point was that, well, I mean these women were in like they were locked up at homes, they couldn't leave, they had no freedom, they were in
Yeah.
abusive marriages. Of course they're going to be hysterical. What do you expect when someone's freedom is taken away from them? So anyway, the example I'm using there is that like so much of what we think are individual problems, yes, we have autonomy as individuals, but also the almost the brutal truth is that they're also social and collective.
Yes, I completely agree. Yes, definitely. And yeah, I agree with this. And if we just make it individual, the system just continues.
Continues, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm
In
being,
order no, you're completely correct.
yeah.
So only when more people stand up and when there is a collective decision that something is being changed and that something is being questioned, that will have a higher impact. So I completely agree.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
and and of, and of course, I mean, this indoctrination does go through the very early on, and without stopping it. And the way are we going to stop it at school if children are indoctrinated through social media, or already through schools we are putting some type of indoctrination on them? That is a big question. And for sure, some action on a bigger level is needed, and on the group level. And that's also why we have all these conversations in the society, and like your podcast,
Yeah.
but also many other people raising their voice and trying to gather people to critically reflect and to group and to stand behind these movements. And even if these movements are too radical, for sure they won't, whatever that means. And for sure some change is still needed, and they will push for it. And I look forward to it, and I do expect something to happen, or I hope for it, because again, with AI we can go into even a stronger
Without a
type of.
doubt. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. What I'm also noticing, this is on a speculative level, I'm also noticing a similar protest coming also from the right, not only coming from the
Oh,
left.
totally, for sure. Yeah. I mean, and that's why, like, I don't even, okay, I'm a leftist, but I use that term very lightly because I don't think these things are left-right things. They're a lot more fundamental than this stupid dualism or binary between left and right. And just on the point you made, Vlasta, on like social media, I'll be talking to a theorist who wrote a book on social media, and like she contends that we should treat social media as the way we treat smoking or alcohol. I mean, there should be like a ban until you're 18, as in it should be illegal to access it. So I don't know. These are interesting topics. But to revisit that
Well,
issue.
I'm not sure whether we should, go so strict, but I definitely think that some type of measures on the online bullying
Oh yeah,
has to be
yeah.
placed because that is very, very damaging for children.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah, we've got numerous cases of, children committing suicide. It's just a complete tragedies. Recently, there's an currently TikTok is being sued because this girl did some stupid challenge and ended up killing herself. Like these TikTok trends and all this. So,
And if you know already, there is already a huge discussion, and in some countries, also very rigorous measures against social robots, because social robots can gain a lot of empathy and influence people to do different stuff, also monitor them or sell them certain products. And of course, if a similar addiction is happening using the social media, I could see a very big danger from it. We also know that there's quite some benefits, and maybe that's why the suggestion is saying, okay, only for adults who are aware how to use it and who have some experience.
but
But I
even
do,
adults don't use it well. So, but
sorry?
even adults misuse it. So,
Of course. No, what I wanted to say something else is I do think that the skills that we have to teach in schools and at universities have to shift, and now we should teach something called digital critical thinking. So
yes.
how to interact with those sources and what the problems with them are.
Yeah. I mean, there's the Canadian theorist Marshall McLuhan, who was the critical media theory, but this was in the 70s, and he was writing when the television came. He was like, "Oh, this television, the medium is going to change society. We need social media literacy and how to deal with that." Yeah, here's where I'd say philosophy is coming back. It's coming back with a vengeance in some sense. But Lossa, this is my last question to you. I mean, as a philosopher of science, I think I don't want to end on a grim note really, because I'm still very optimistic for thinking, for science, all of this. I mean, as you know, I'm going into trying to go back into academia and hopefully follow in your footsteps and try and become a professor one day in life. But are you optimistic for science, for thinking? I mean, I should just ask, are you optimistic for the university as such?
I wouldn't be part of it if I wasn't.
Yeah, I'm glad to, because like I don't know, in the past like few months, I've become a bit pessimistic just seeing things in the world. And one place, in some sense, I always idealize is academia. I'm like, there are still people who are asking these difficult questions and still thinking. And okay, not just, I shouldn't just say academia. I mean both let's say a certain ilk of people who they either they were a part of academia, but now they're doing their work in their own private projects, but they're still continuing on this work of, I would say, to put it naively, being human, asking these fundamental questions. So, yeah, I think we should be optimistic, despite the sometimes the times, So, yeah,
Well, we should be the change that we want to see in the system
absolutely.
and stand our ground. And I noticed this phenomenon that once one person stands their ground, you discover many more people sharing the same beliefs and having the same opinions, just not speaking out because they don't understand that actually we are in the majority or that we can shift something. That was actually the case of the policies regarding sexual harassment on conferences, and once I stood up, many more people stood up and spoke. And not only sexual harassment, also general harassment and general culture, which is
Bullying or
problematic. So a lot of men also stood up to say, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, but men also experience sexual harassment in academia and so on. But that is one aspect, and the second aspect. So I do believe that we are maybe more as a group or as a movement, if that would be. Then of course we could change even more. So let's not make it individual. Of course, the group is far more powerful. But the second thing is this, that you find it that you have this. You said you had this idealization of academia, and that is dangerous. That makes science less trustworthy because people idealize it a lot, and I think we should demystify it,
Yeah, yeah,
not have it on this pedestal, not buy into this elitist trap. Just consider it as any other type of work, and consider people as all other people who are just dedicated, specialized for something.
Well,
But yeah, with all the flaws and all the virtues of other people as well. And because we know that one source of disappointment and distrust in science is when people are idealizing it and then realize, okay, but there are quite some flaws. So I think we shouldn't idealize it, but also we don't have to go into, and also we shouldn't go into this scientistic view that science is solving everything, that science is so powerful and so on. So both on the human levels, those are just normal humans. This is not a vocation, it's just a job. And this last aspect, that science cannot solve all the questions, but as we mentioned today, it can be very, very useful.
yeah, yeah, yep, certainly. And I mean, I'll take that advice to heart. In fact, we did discuss this in our previous conversation about not idealizing science. But now, once again, Vlasta, for the now this is your third appearance. Thank you very much for your time. I'll see how people respond to this episode. I'm sure there'll be some heated discussions, especially when the word capitalism is in the title. For some reason, the comments get very heated up, both on Spotify and YouTube. So we'll see how people react to this. But again, thank you very much for your time, Vlasta. I'm very grateful.
Thank you so much for the great topic and for having me.